Thank you, students, administration, for the honor to be here and talk about the Constitution, a subject that I love, and that it's at the heart of some concerns of our country today. So today I'd like to discuss with you a critical issue that faces our nation. And this is the issue. Is the Constitution of our country divinely inspired and worthy of our vigorous defense? Or is it a secular document in need of drastic overhaul to comply with current societal trends? And this raises a preliminary question. Did the Founding Fathers coincidentally and conveniently appear on the scene at the same time, or rather, were they raised up by God to establish a nation and a constitution that was inspired by Him? Well, unfortunately, it's become academically in vogue to denigrate many of our Founding Fathers. Undoubtedly, they did have imperfections, as do all men. But nonetheless, they were chosen instruments in God's hands. God had the eternal perspective to see beyond their weaknesses and instead capitalize on their integrity and their incredible strengths. He could see the masterpiece behind the few flawed strokes of their lives. Well, God Himself addressed this subject when He said in the Doctrine and Covenants, "And for this purpose have I established the Constitution of this land by the hands of wise men whom I raised up unto this very purpose." Years ago, President Wilford Woodruff shared this sacred experience. He said that in 1877, the signers of the Declaration of Independence and George Washington appeared to him in the St. George Temple on 2 consecutive nights and made the following observation and plea. They said to him, "You have had use of the endowment house for a number of years, and yet nothing has been done for us. We laid the foundation of the government you now enjoy, and we never apostatized from it, but we remained true to it and were faithful to God. Further request, you may know that the baptismal and other temple work was then done for them." Some years later, in a general conference of the church, President Wilford Woodruff testified, quote, "I'm going to bear my testimony to this assembly, if I never do it again in my life, that those men who laid the foundation of the American government and signed the Declaration of Independence were the best spirits the God of heaven could find on the face of the earth. They were choice spirits, not wicked men. George Washington and all the men that labored for the purpose were inspired of the Lord." Even historians, secular historians, understood there was something unique and special about these Founding Fathers. Barbara Tuchman, one such historian, noted, "It would be invaluable if we could know what produced this burst of talent from a base of only 2.5 million inhabitants who then lived in America. But we do know what produced this burst of talent. It was not a series of random births or genetic aberrations. Rather, it was pursuant to God's master plan for America. The Bible tells us that God hath, quote, determined the times before appointed," meaning when we would be born, "and the bounds of their habitation," meaning where we would be born, Acts 17:26. And so it was with the Founding Fathers. God sent them forth at a specified time and place to fulfill their divinely appointed mission. And what was that mission? It was to form a government that would establish our God-given rights, including freedom of speech and religion, so we would become a nation under God, not a nation without God. Well, the Declaration, as you know, of Independence sets forth our God-given rights. But in and of itself, the Declaration is not sufficient. We needed a document that would not just define these rights, but also protect them. Hence the need for the Constitution. Well, in the Kirtland dedicatory prayer, we read this tribute to the Constitution. "May those principles which were so honorably and nobly defended, namely the Constitution of our land, by our fathers, be established forever." Joseph Smith loved the Constitution. He said, quote, "I am the greatest advocate of the Constitution of the U.S. there is on the earth." President Ezra Taft Benson bore his testimony of its divine nature. Quote, "I reverence the Constitution of the United States as a sacred document. To me, the words are akin to the revelations of God, for God has placed his stamp of approval on the Constitution of the land." No wonder President David O. McKay instructed us as members of the church, quote, "Next to being one and worshiping God, there is nothing in this world upon which the church should be more united than in upholding and defending the Constitution of the United States." Is there any question how the prophets of this church felt and do feel about the Constitution? Lincoln was so enamored with the Constitution and so loved it that he wrote, "Let the Constitution be preached from the pulpit, proclaimed in legislative halls, and enforced in courts of justice, and in short, let it," meaning the Constitution, "become the political religion of the nation." William Gladstone, who was a former British Prime Minister, observed, quote, "The American Constitution is the most wonderful work ever struck off at a given time by the brain and purpose of man." And James Madison, who's known as the father of the Constitution, its prime author, reflected upon the hand of God in such a document when he said, quote, "It is impossible for the man of pious reflection not to perceive in it," meaning the Constitution, "a finger of that almighty hand which has been so frequently and signally extended to our relief in the critical stages of the Revolution." But the next question becomes, how does the Constitution reflect the hand of the Almighty? President Dallin H. Oaks, formerly a law professor at the University of Chicago and justice of the Utah Supreme Court, tells of a professor who over time spoke to a number of religious students, many of them like you. The professor then made this surprising comment. "They all seemed to believe that the Constitution was divinely inspired, but none of them could ever tell me what it meant or how it affected their interpretation of the Constitution." President Oaks took that as a challenge and then wrote a brilliant article setting forth 5 ways in which the Constitution is inspired, all of which were included in his most recent General Conference talk in April of this year. I would invite you to read it and to study it carefully. Well, because the Constitution was inspired, it was not just a patchwork of ideas from other nations' charter documents. James Madison, the father of the Constitution, spoke of the uniqueness of this document in the entirety of all history. He said, "The Founding Fathers reared the fabrics of government which have no model on the face of the earth." Who then were these Founding Fathers that produced such a remarkable document? Were they heroes, or as some claim, villains? Ted Stewart, a federal judge and author, put this question in its proper light. Today, he said, it is common to criticize the founders of America, judging them by today's standards of equality and justice. They do fail. Some owned slaves. None fought to give women equal rights. Most were wealthy white men. Yes, judging the founders by today's standards of equality and justice, they fail. But there is just one problem, he said, with judging them by today's standards, and it is this. But for these imperfect founders and the sacrifices they made and the instruments of government which they created, there would be no current enlightened standards of equality and justice by which to judge them. Judge Stewart is so right. The reason the critics can freely criticize, protest, vote for change, run for office, and exercise freedom of religion or irreligion as they choose is for one reason and one reason only. Because the Founding Fathers made it so. We are part of the greatest democracy the world has or will ever know. If unwilling to acknowledge the Founding Fathers' inspired and timely experiment, one must ask, do the critics believe our liberties came about by chance? or that they were spawned by evil men? If so, how do they reconcile such a position with the unerring logic of the Savior who said, "A good tree cannot bring forth evil fruit, neither can a corrupt tree bring forth good fruit"? It seems somewhat hypocritical to partake of and enjoy the good fruits of liberty today, while at the same time criticizing the very tree that produced such good fruit, namely the Founding Fathers. Some might argue, as they have done, that even without our Founding Fathers, our democracy would have eventually evolved, and therefore they did nothing special. But history would not be kind to such a proposition. At the time of our founders' noble experience, there was nothing like it in the world. For centuries, even millennia of recorded history, there was no comparable democracy that had the breadth of liberties and the lasting power of what they created. Theirs was a bold and ingenious initiative from which many other countries would subsequently pattern their governments. If nothing else, the burden of proof has shifted to the critics. That the Founding Fathers established our democracy is a certainty. That there would have been a similar democracy without them, as claimed by some naysayers, is no more than a speculative possibility without any historical precedent whatsoever. Despite the overwhelming evidence that the Constitution is an inspired document, Joseph Smith prophesied that one day it would hang by a thread. I wondered for a time if this prophecy was adequately documented. But I now know that this language, or similar language, was substantiated by Brigham Young, John Taylor, Jedediah M. Grant, Eliza R. Snow, and others. President Ezra Taft Benson spoke of that specific prophecy and how the Constitution would be saved in the last days, when he said, quote, "It will be saved by the citizens of this nation who love and cherish freedom. It will be saved by enlightened members of the church, men and women who will subscribe to and abide the principles of the Constitution." Hopefully, this includes reference to you and to me. Well, as inspired as the Constitution is, the Founding Fathers repeatedly declared that it could not exist as a viable and effective document unless first and foremost there existed a moral people to operate it. But who determines what is moral? A professor, a politician, a judge, a social activist, the so-called enlightened elite? So there would be no question about that answer, who determines morality. The Founding Fathers responded in remarkable unison and clarity. They said morality was to be determined solely by the will of God. Thomas Jefferson wrote, "Whatever is to be our destiny, wisdom as well as duty dictates that we should acquiesce in the will of Him whose it is to give and take away." He then added that Jesus' moral laws are the most sublime and benevolent code of morals which has ever been offered to man. Washington concurred. He said, "It's the duty of all nations to acknowledge the providence of the Almighty God and to obey His will." And James Wilson, who signed the Declaration of Independence and Constitution and later became one of the original justices of the U.S. Supreme Court, wrote, quote, "Having thus stated the question, what is the efficient cause of moral obligation? I give this answer: the will of God. This is the supreme law, His just and full right of imposing laws, and our duty in obeying them are the sources of our moral obligation." As a result, the Founding Fathers understood the critical nexus between morality and religion. John Adams observed and warned, "We have no government armed with power, capable of contending with human passions, unbridled by morality and religion. Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other." George Washington was in full accord. He said, "Of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. Why the reference to religion as well as to morals? Because the Founding Fathers knew that religion was the best catalyst, the best vehicle for fostering a moral people. They knew that religion was the prime source to inspire people to embrace and live God's will. Perhaps Alexander Hamilton stated it most succinctly when he said, "Morality must fall without religion." King Mosiah understood that freedom without religion was illusory. Quote, "And under his Christ's head ye are made free, and there is no other head whereby ye can be made free." The Lord emphasized the same truth to the Jaredites. "Behold, this is a choice land, and whatsoever nation shall possess it shall be free from bondage and from captivity and from all other nations under heaven, if they will but serve the God of the land, who is Jesus Christ." Some years ago, Harvard professor Clayton Christensen had a profoundly insightful conversation with a Marxist economist from China who was in Boston on a Fulbright scholarship. He asked him if he had learned anything that was surprising or unexpected while in the U.S. Without hesitation replied, "Yes, I had no idea how critical religion is to the functioning of democracy. Democracy works because most people, most of the time, voluntarily choose to obey the law." He then added that Americans followed the rules because they had come to believe they just weren't accountable to society. They were also accountable to God. Professor Christensen then explained concern over what would happen to our democracy if religion were diminished in America and people no longer voluntarily chose to obey the law. He then offered this tragic conclusion: if you take away religion, you cannot hire enough police. The Founding Fathers understood this principle. The more the morality and religion, the less the need for government intervention and enforcement, and thus the greater our liberties. Well, if God's moral law and religion are not the foundation for our society, then secularism, meaning moral relativism, will rapidly and radically replace the void, and our Constitution will effectively be nullified. Since religion is indeed the best vehicle to encourage the living of God's moral laws, the Founding Fathers demonstrated both by their words and actions that religion in general should be encouraged in public as well as the private sector without ever establishing a national religion. Based on the rationale in the Supreme Court case, Town of Greece versus Galloway, decided in 2014, the Supreme Court ruled that freedom of religion can best be determined under the Constitution if we can discover the original intent of the Founding Fathers on the subject, as evidenced by their, quote, historical practices and understandings. This seems reasonable, as who would know better the intent of the First Amendment than the very men who debated and drafted its language? What then were their feelings and practices concerning the need for religion in the public sector in order to advance our morals? First, religion in public education. The Northwest Ordinance, which regulated the western expansion of the United States, was ratified in 1789 by whom? The same Congress that adopted the Constitution that year. It stated, quote, "Religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind, schools, and the means of education shall forever be encouraged." Benjamin Rush, a Founding Father, wrote, "The only foundation for a useful education in a republic is to be laid in religion." And Governor Morris, another Founding Father, penned, "Religion is the only solid basis of good morals. Therefore, education should teach the principles of religion and the duties of man towards God." What did the Founding Fathers say should be encouraged and taught in schools? Religion and morality. Consistent with this thinking, it's interesting to note that in the year 1787, the same year the Constitution was written, Yale University gave these instructions to its incoming students. Quote, "All the scholars are required to live a religious and blameless life according to the rules of God's Word, diligently reading the Holy Scriptures, that fountain of divine light and truth, and constantly attending all the duties of religion." How far afield we have come from the Founding Fathers, strayed from their original understanding of what an education should be based upon, namely morality and religion. Second, the place of religion in government. John Jay, a founding father and the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, noted, quote, "It is the duty of all wise, free, and virtuous governments to do what? To countenance and encourage virtue and religion." Joseph Story, a Harvard law professor and a member of the U.S. Supreme Court from 1812 to 1845, wrote the famous commentaries on the Constitution of the United States. In so doing, he came to the following conclusion, quote, "It yet remains a problem to be solved in human affairs whether any free government can be permanent, where the public worship of God and the support of religion constitute no part of the policy or duty of the state in any assignable shape." Third, religion and public monuments. Numerous public monuments sanctioned and paid for by our government make reference to God. For example, Lincoln's second inaugural address, engraved on the wall of the Lincoln Memorial, mentions God 14 times and references the Bible 4 times. Does that sound like a government that wanted to remove references to God and the Bible from the public domain? Fourth, religious prayer in the public sector. Prayer has been the focus of presidential prayer breakfasts and the traditional beginning of each U.S. congressional session, offered by a paid clergyman, initiated and sanctioned by whom? The Founding Fathers. Fifth, religion and government pronouncements and activities. Our currency currently contains the words, "In God we trust." Our national anthem makes reference to God. Our Pledge of Allegiance acknowledges that we are one nation under God. All of these evidence God's encouragement of religion in the public sector. Sixth, religion as practiced by Thomas Jefferson in the public sector. Thomas Jefferson is often quoted by the secularists for his statement about a wall of separation between church and state. A statement that is often taken out of context. Jefferson was responding to a letter from the Danbury Baptists who were concerned that the free exercise of religion clause might be interpreted as a government-granted right and thus subject to man's change or compromise rather than a God-given right that could not be rightfully changed or compromised by man under any circumstance whatsoever. Based on this concern, Jefferson replied that the free exercise of religion clause was a restoration of what he called man's natural right, meaning a right that pre-existed government, namely a God-given right. Accordingly, Jefferson assured the concerned Baptists there was a wall preventing government from intruding into the free exercise of religion, but likewise a wall that prevented the establishment of a national religion. In other words, government was not to prohibit the establishment or prohibit the free exercise of religion in the public sector, with one exception. There was no establishment of a national religion. This is the exact opposite of how many have interpreted the phrase. Consistent with this interpretation, Jefferson wrote on another occasion this clarifying statement: "Certainly no power to prescribe any religious exercise or assume authority in religious discipline has been delegated to the general," meaning federal, government. It must then rest with the states. What a difference from how Jefferson is often quoted. Furthermore, if actions speak louder than words, then Jefferson's actions should evidence his true opinion on the role of religion in the public sector. In his second inaugural address, he invited the audience to, quote, join with him in supplications to God for the nation's well-being. Was this not encouragement of prayer? A practice at the heart of religion made from the nation's preeminent public pulpit? And why did he, along with Benjamin Franklin, if they were opposed to the expression of religion in public, propose a national seal with these words, God or Providence has favored our undertakings, knowing that such seal would become a public symbol? In addition, Jefferson, as well as James Madison, the father of the Constitution, attended church services where, of all places, in the Capitol building, one of the most visible of all government buildings. If this were not enough to evidence Jefferson's feelings about the interdependency between religion and government, Jefferson also authorized federal funds for Christian missionaries to preach the gospel to the Native Americans. These actions clearly condoned religious worship in public settings and the use of government money for religious purposes. Nonetheless, the courts have often quoted Jefferson's one-off phrase out of context in order to prohibit religious instruction, prayers, and reading of the Bible in schools, to remove displays of the Ten Commandments from public buildings, even though such Ten Commandments is on the wall of the Supreme Court, and to outlaw displays of a Christmas creche. No one knew the Supreme Court Justice William Rehnquist, who served for many years on the Supreme Court, said, "The wall of separation between church and state is a metaphor based on bad history, a metaphor which has proved useless as a guide to judging. It should be frankly and explicitly abandoned." Our nation's history is saturated with references to God because his influence has been profound in the discovery, establishment, and preservation of this nation. Accordingly, we pay tribute to God through the presence of religious symbols and practices in both private and public settings. It is nothing less than historical fiction to think that our government did not support and encourage religion for our nation's first 200 years. The initial intent of the Founding Fathers was clear: to promote and encourage religion in both the private and public sectors, and by so doing reinforce the moral principles upon which our nation was built, but at the same time never establish a national religion. That was the balance. Our Founding Fathers would be shocked to hear some advocate that religion should be expressed only in the confines of one's home or the seclusion of a private chapel, that it should be non-existent in the public domain. It would be anathema to them and all they stood for. Religion to them was the prime source for reinforcing the moral values essential to the ongoing viability of our Constitution. They knew that without religion and morality, the Constitution could not endure. I love our Constitution and its inspired principles. I honor and respect our Founding Fathers, who made incredible sacrifices to establish and preserve the liberties we so abundantly enjoy. I revere and honor the American flag and the ideals for which it stands. I cherish the times I can pledge allegiance or sing the Star-Spangled Banner. There's a sacred spirit that accompanies these symbols and activities. Why? Because they are divinely inspired. I acknowledge and express gratitude to God for his merciful hand in the origin, establishment, and destiny of America. His fingerprints are literally everywhere present. It is now our choice, and America's choice, to continue the legacy of our Founding Fathers or to cast it aside, to be a nation under God or without God. Sensing this, President Dallin H. Oaks wrote, "The Constitution of the U.S. is inspired. Through embracing its principles, we can enhance unity and tranquility among citizens and we can continue to face the future with faith. I, the Lord, justify you and your brethren of my church in befriending that law which is the constitutional law of the land. May we courageously support and sustain and defend this inspired document. Then we will be entitled to this promise of the psalmist. Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord. In the name of Jesus Christ, who is indeed the God of this land. Amen.
Amen.
All right. Does someone have a question they'd like to ask? Yes. Why don't you stand and give your name?
Lester. So like, it took almost 100 years for the 13th Amendment to be ratified.
Could speak louder, could you
It
please?
almost took 100 years for the 13th Amendment to be ratified. Why do you think it took so long?
That's a fair question. Some people believe that the Constitution didn't really provide for freedom for the slaves. And there was actually a Supreme Court case on that by Roger Taney, who was the Supreme Court Justice in, I think, 1857. And he said that the Constitution didn't provide for freedom of the slaves. And then someone corrected him. You know who corrected him? Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln said, "You're wrong." He said the Constitution provided for the freedom of all people. That was the ideal, but it didn't have the means to enforce it at the time. The federal government wasn't strong enough to enforce it. They were just barely strong enough to get a union together. But he said it provided the ideals, and it provided that as the circumstances would permit, that all those freedoms in the Constitution would be provided for all people. And if you read in the Doctrine and Covenants, section 101, it talks about, therefore it's not right that one man should be bondage to another. And then the very next sentence is, and for this purpose have I established the constitution of the land. And you have to read the rest of it. It says, and redeemed the land by the shedding of blood. He knew that it would take the Constitution to set the ideals, but it would finally take the Civil War to give the federal government the power to enforce it. And then eventually we got the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which just enshrined the ideals that were already in the Constitution. Question? Yes.
So was it, I'm Andrew, by the way, was it Thomas Jefferson you said that was often misquoted?
Yes.
Okay, so my question is then, if he's so often misquoted, and I don't know too much about the lawmaking process and the discussions that go into that, but why isn't the other side that you described today, why isn't that often brought up as well in rebuttal to those discussions?
It should be. In fact, it's like Columbus. I decided to read the original sources on the life of Columbus. And you get 9/10 of them are opposed to Columbus, and you read the original sources. There's really four actual historical accounts that take place at the time of Columbus. The key one is by somebody named Bartholomew Lucassus. And if you read those accounts of the original historians, they believe that Columbus wasn't the greatest colonizer in the world, but that he was a good man, and that he wanted, in fact, he had two main purposes. I don't know if you know this, because you won't read this in your history books in high school. Two main purposes. One was to convert the Native American Indians to Christianity, and two is to use the gold they found. You know for what purpose? You don't read about this in high school. Like, we have a letter from him to the king and queen to reconquer Jerusalem so they could build a temple for the second coming of the Savior in preparation for it. So if you start reading the original sources, you start to get a different feeling. There is one source that's bad about Columbus. His name's Francisco Bobadilla. He was the one who took over from Columbus, and he told the people, the Spaniards, you go ahead and rape, maraud, murder, do whatever you want. This is a one-shot chance to do this. And he's the one who writes the bad stuff about Columbus. The ones that would be like kind of Hitler writing a history of the Jews. How impartial do you think that would be? Or the Pharisees and Sadducees writing a history of the life of Christ. If you read the impartial ones, witnesses, it's incredible. In fact, when he did send some slaves back to Spain, it's true. But when he sent the first batch to Spain, or slaves back to Spain, people forget to mention they were cannibals. And the neighboring tribe had said, would you please protect us against these cannibals who were raping our women and eating our people? He sends them back with a letter to the king and queen, of which we have a copy, saying, please teach them Christianity so they can come back and reclaim the people. Bartholomew Las also, who was a defender of the indigenous people, and not afraid to be critical of Columbus, said the real problems with the colonies and the indecencies that were imposed upon them began in the year 1504. Why is that important? Because Columbus had finished his fourth journey by 1504 and was no longer there. Minor omission. In fact, Carol Delaney, who's the Stanford professor who probably knows more about Columbus than any other person, said, when I read the original documents, I gained a completely different understanding of Columbus. Completely different understanding. That he had a love for the indigenous people, and that most of the atrocities which he is accused took place when he wasn't even there or didn't even happen. So why doesn't it happen? Well, it's because the world, unfortunately, our students are 95% of the world's standpoint and 5% of the Lord's. But I just say, read the original sources if you want to know the truth. When people tell me something about Columbus, I said, where'd you get it from? Vox.com? Is that where you got it from? What's the original source? That's what I want to know. So the question isn't who teaches what. The question is, what's the truth and how do I find it? Just read the original letter of Jefferson. All you have to do is read the original letter of Jefferson to the Danbury Baptist. Take the time. You have to do your homework. Read the original letter and don't take what someone else tells you. And then look at his actions in his own life, and you put 2 and 2 together and you get 4. Sorry, I went on a little long. Not that I feel passionate about that. Will we take one more question, should we? Or what do you want? Is there one more question? Be easy on me.
Well, mine's a little...
You can take that mask off. Just ask the question, I think, okay?
Mine is a little bit harder, but I know you'll have the answer.
No, I don't think so.
I've read your book,
Okay.
The Infinite Atonement. You have the answer.
Well, I don't know if I will.
Now, I've always wanted to understand what it means by the Constitution being hung by a thread, and it says that, you put it up.
Yeah, basically it talks about the men and women will come together and they'll live the principles and stand for the principles, defend the principles of the Constitution, and I think that's happening today. Honestly, I think that's happening today. We're seeing the Constitution being eroded by many people, and there needs to be a group of people who will stand up and defend it, not as a perfect document, but it was designed to prepare us for a more perfect union step by step. And that if we want to change it, we don't change it by some legislative action, we change it by amendment. There's a built-in system to change the Constitution, and that's by amendment, not by some judicial action or executive order.
Do you see a place, a time where our freedom of religion would be severed?
Well, I don't think it will be severed, but I think we've already seen it eroded in some of the Supreme Court decisions that we've had. But fortunately, we had this decision in 2014, which stated that if the Founding Fathers did it, that should be good enough for us, because they're the ones who instituted the First Amendment, therefore they ought to know what it means. But that's the difference today. We have, and maybe I'm getting off, but we have two different ways to interpret the Constitution. One is known as originalism. And originalism is that let's find out what the Founding Fathers understood it to be, and that's how it should be interpreted, regardless of what my political preferences may be. The other is known as the living document method, is that we've got to kind of roll with what society wants, and the Constitution should roll with it. I'm opposed to that, because I don't think it just rolls with what society wants. It rolls with amendments that are made to the Constitution. Otherwise, you don't have a fixed standard from which to operate. It just changes with every political party in power. Thank you.
There's one more. Could you take one more?
One more?
Well, I have one last question for you. You kind of just touched on it, but I'm just curious. You said that you quoted Joseph Smith saying it's going to hang by a thread, and the righteous saints of the church basically will uphold it, will defend it. And I was just curious, what does that look like in today's day? Like, obviously we can live the principles, but what can we do to defend and uphold the Constitution?
What do you think we can do?
I'm asking you.
I'm not letting you off the hook, you know. He said the same, came to the Savior and he said, you know, what's the first and great commandment? The Savior said to him, well, what do you think it is?
That's true.
You're a thinker.
That's true. Well, obviously, like, upholding its principles, in my opinion, would mean living what it teaches, basically, following the principles contained in the document, and then standing up for those people who are going against it, I guess, like standing up against them. So if they're trying to make those changes to the document, then you stand up and defend the originalism that we
Very
talked
good.
about.
And I think you vote for people who feel the same way. Thank you. You answered your own question.
Perfect.
Right, it's a perfect answer.
Everybody's great, so.